Hi, and welcome everyone at home watching live or watching a recording of the session. I am Laila Tara from the International Tibet Network, and I'm very happy to be organizing this very important session today together with Free Tibet and Tibet Watch. And a warm welcome to both of my guests, Tenzin Choekyi and John Jones. Tenzin Choekyi is senior researcher at Tibet Watch. She provides analysis of contemporary Tibet to campaigners, politicians, and journalists, just as she will do for us today. And she's also the leading researcher and author of the Drago report that we're discussing. It's an honor to have you today. And John Jones, he is the head of campaigns, policy, and research at Free Tibet, where he has worked since 2015. During this time, he has regularly worked in close partnership with the wider Tibet movement. And we are very happy to be having him to help us kind of contextualize the findings of the report. Just a quick note to all the live viewers before we start. If you have any questions about any on the topics related to what we're speaking about today, please put them into the comment section. We will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions, put them in there and hopefully they'll get answered at the end of the session. Thank you very much. In January this year, Tibet Watch released a report, Desecration in Drago County, Destruction of Tibetan Religious Heritage, Arbitrary Detention and Torture. This report documents the extent to which the acts of police and local authorities in Drago County have violated Tibetans' right to self-determination and freedom of religion, education, expression, and assembly. They have also restricted Tibetans' freedom to take part in cultural life, as well as their rights to privacy, liberty, security of person, and freedom from torture. This, of course, is shocking to read and to hear, but unfortunately for us Tibetans and everyone familiar with Tibet's occupation by China, this is not necessarily surprising to us, which just shows how bad things have gotten. Choekyi, what's really, really special about this report is how timely you managed to get the information out of Tibet, a place that has been so locked down over the last years, just making it really difficult for, any information reaching the outside world, really. So question I was wondering is, how did you start becoming aware of what was happening in Drago, and kind of what were the challenges that you encountered when collecting your data and doing your research?
Sure. Thank you, Leila and International Tibetan Network for organizing this discussion, and also to everyone attending online for your interest in Drago and Tibet in general. We first became aware about Drago through a fragment of information, like every other Tibetan news that we get nowadays, especially after 2008. It was in late October 2021. Tibet Watch received information about a demolition of a monastic school in Drago, as a result of which over 100 students had nowhere to study and live. So that was how we first became aware of what's going on in Drago, and it was heartbreaking at the time. But we didn't know, and nor could we foresee how this information would unfold into a story of such scale and scope. So week after week, the demolition escalated to, desecration of statues, temple, giant prayer wheels, and throughout this period, paramilitary troops and informers were deployed across the county to gather intelligence of what the Tibetans were, doing and reacting. And as a result, many innocent Tibetans were locked up without any formal charges, detained and tortured. So under such circumstances, and a deliberate atmosphere of fear, manufactured to quell dissent and cut ties with Tibetans abroad, we were faced with many key challenges, which I'm sure every Tibetan living in exile and diaspora knows, especially those with contacts inside Tibet. The first one is receiving information on the same day of it happening, And the second is the paralyzing fear of Tibetan sources, both inside and abroad, to reveal their identity. And thirdly, the moral dilemma created by the police for families to choose between families' safety and their right to freedom and justice in sharing this information without fear. So these were the, how we were faced with the challenges throughout the Trango report research.
Thank you. And, kudos to everyone who's taking the risk and still trying to get information out there. I don't think we can imagine how brave people must be. So, and thank you for, doing the research and trying and getting the information. So, Choekyi, in your report, you have kind of documented the developments that have been taking place since 2008. So for people watching today but who have not read the report yet, what are kind of the main findings that you would like to highlight?
Sure. I have a presentation prepared for this so that people can remember visually what happened. Can we have the slide, please? Thank you. So can we have the next slide, please? I will first start with what was demolished, the reasons given by the local authorities for the demolition, the coercive tactics used against local Tibetans, arbitrary detentions and torture, and new constructions of security facilities for re-education. And the photo you are seeing in front of you is from late January 2022, which was one of the biggest protest that was happening during the watershed, period of Tibetan recent history. Drago County, all these findings that we have unearthed should be situated within the context of the recent past of Drago County, of the mass protests in 2008, 2009, and 12, during which Tibetans called for freedom and return of their exiled leader, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And all of these periods were marked with local Tibetans being detained, severely beaten, fired with tear gas and live ammunition. And in one instance, an entire family of a protester was attacked in what the source described as being a rainstorm of bullets. So in that family, there was a dog. Even that dog was shot and killed, and injured bodies from that family were dragged downhill on a motorbike by the police. And in this photo, you see people's armed police, their armored vehicles, just occupying the tri-junction of the Drago County. And in the left, bottom left, you see the row of houses. That's where the 45 giant prayer wheels used to be. Next slide, please. So all of this happened a decade ago. And then in mid-October 2021, a Chinese Communist Party official previously linked to the demolitions of thousands of monks and nuns' residence at the famous Buddhist Institute of Larungar, he became the party secretary of Drago County. And shortly afterwards, a series of desecration of religious and cultural heritage and arbitrary detention and torture of Tibetans followed. So in between October 2021 to April 2022, sites and objects of central importance to the religious and cultural life of Tibetans in Drago were demolished, one after another. 90% of them were built on a sacred hill, as you can see here. All these sacred places, sites, are close to each other, and therefore they form a circuit for local Tibetans to go for Kora circumambulation. And you can easily imagine standing on the foreground of the Drago Monastery, looking at all the ruins after the demolition, and understand without a doubt why local Tibetans have described the scale of demolitions as a second cultural revolution. Next slide, please. What they demolished include, first, from top left to right, you can see 3 colossal Buddhist statues, the top left of which was built with the intention to prevent famine, war, and natural disasters. And then you have a Buddhist school, which gave training for over 100 students, not only in ancient Buddhist philosophy, but also foreign languages such as Mandarin and English. And then 45 giant prayer wheels, which were used daily by lay Tibetan population and pilgrims alike. Then also a residence of a revered spiritual leader. And then finally, prayer flags on top of the Drago monastery, which were also taken down and burned. Next slide, please. And you can see the footage sent by Tibetan sources very courageously, knowing the risk that it would, put on their lives. You see the demolition of Drago County here, a Drago monastic school, and it's the local Tibetans who were coerced to tear down their school. Next slide, please. You see here the rows of walls that once separated the 45 giant prayer wheels. They are no longer there, and on the right side of the photo you see two children just playing in the empty walls. Next slide, please. Then you have the Drago Monastery towards the right, where you see the red pin. That's a temple which housed the Maitreya Buddha statue, Buddha of the future. And then you see the after demolition photo where the black pin is. It's no longer there. Next slide, please. And then the over 99-foot Buddha statue, it was called, colloquially called People's Buddha, Mimangyuku, because it was built with, voluntary contributions from the local farmers and nomads. And it was a huge statue built to prevent earthquake and natural disasters, especially because in 1973, at the peak of the Cultural Revolution, Drago County witnessed a devastating earthquake that claimed thousands of lives. So it was a way of Tibetan to, follow their own religion and culture and find their own ways of preventing natural disasters. So even that Buddha statue, which didn't harm anyone, was pulled down. Next slide, please. Then you have a Guru Rinpoche statue, which was in further south in Drago County. That was also pulled down. You see the dome structure on the left is, on the floor in the photo to the right. Next slide, please. So during these demolitions, the local authorities have given various reasons. They've said that the statue is too high, it's illegal construction, and there's need for fire access. We found one official media coverage of the school demolition, which cited the same reason, of illegal construction, but it was taken off the internet and is now nowhere to be found. And the way these demolitions initially took place revealed the coercive tactics used by the local police authorities. So how they did was two senior monks of the monastery, deeply revered by the local Tibetans, were first summoned to the county police station, and they were threatened to convince the local Tibetans to demolish the school themselves within 4 days. The second time they were summoned, the demolition order was for the two giant statues located on the sacred hill. The pair of monks were told that if they demolished it themselves, they could keep the sacred contents inside them, which were used to consecrate them. It appears that the monks refused to do this. They were both detained for over a week, denied adequate food, and tortured. The demolition proceeded with monks and other influential community members being forced to assist in the demolitions. After the demolitions were completed in April 2022, local Chinese authorities forced Tibetan monks to sign a letter claiming that it was them who destroyed their Buddha statue. And during these months, armed paramilitary troops were deployed in large numbers at the crossroads of the demolition area of Sedilong village, and informers were distributed across Drago to gather intelligence. Police also stepped up random phone search operations during the period. And so, as a result, at least 10 Tibetans were detained for reasons as minor as showing distress at the demolitions and sharing information, sharing truth to people outside Tibet. They were all taken to what sources describe as being a re-education center. So that's what you're looking at right now, re-education center. No, it's the previous slide, sorry. Yeah, that's the re-education center. It's nearly 5,000 meters square, and in this building, Tibetans were taken, beaten, severely beaten to the point of several of them falling unconscious, and one of them, a woman, was drenched with cold water in the freezing winter weather. And we used anecdotal accounts and satellite images, and we have now identified and tracked changes in security infrastructure in Drago County. There are now 3 facilities which have been built and are functioning following the 2012 local mass protests, and they now surround the Drago County in its suburbs. The first one is the Re-Education Center, as you see here. And the second one is in the next slide. It's a new prison located in the southern suburbs of Choekyi. You see in the 4 timeline photos that in 2008 and 2009 and 2011 there's no prison in the top in the bottom left. Then afterwards in 2015 and 19 there's a prison, and by 2019 the security walls have also, they've built new security walls. Next slide, please. This shows the old prison located in the county center. So this was the prison where mass detention, Tibetans who were detained in the 2012 protests were taken to. And it seems that at the time there were so many Tibetans arrested that there was no space to put in any more Tibetans. So nearby schools were turned as temporary place to keep and detain the Tibetans. So it appears as though the new prison that I just showed earlier was constructed out of the need to of more space for Tibetans if large number of arrests occur like it happened in 2012. So by September 2019, you see in the right photo on the right that the prison is no longer there, it's been demolished. And the next slide shows a military base, an army base in the central left. The red circle there is used as a military base. And when you now picture how Drago County is in 2023, you have Re-Education Center in the top right, the red circle, that's where the Re-Education Center is. And then you have at the center bottom the new prison, and then you have to the center left the army base. So Drago County, this valley, this place known for its strong sense of Tibetan identity and resistance against the Chinese government, whose Tibetans have protested in front of the police station in 2012. Tibetans who were shot in front of the local police station. Tibetans who were also shot in their own homes. In 2012, you have this county surrounded by security facilities. And a decade on, none of their demands and calls have been answered. Their calls for freedom, return of their exiled leader, His Holiness Dalai Lama, and freedom to live their life with freedom and dignity in their own land, with their religion and culture. So this is just one story of what happened in one county in Tibet, as a Tibetan from Drago County, now living in exile, put it very eloquently. He said, and you can see it in the next slide, as with other areas in Tibet, the main reason for increasing Chinese repression in Drago is first to eradicate Tibetan identity and Tibetan culture. Secondly, to eliminate those influential Tibetans who are conscious of freedom and rights of Tibetan people. And thirdly, to abolish Tibetan language in education centers. So this is what we have found from researching, beginning first with a fragment of information of Drago County, the school demolition, and then it gradually unfolded into a bigger story of how this area, who has been put through so much violence, but the Tibetans there would still risk their lives to share the truth with the world. And in the last slide, I have a photo of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Drago Monastery. This was taken, I think, at least a decade ago in Drago County. But we know that Dalai Lama, now 87 years old, he's still living in exile, and the Tibetans in Drago still hope for his return. And even if he cannot return, but they don't even have the least of freedom to live their life with freedom and dignity. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Choekyi. It's been very impressive to see. Your presentation was great. It really makes it so much more tangible what is happening. And I think, I speak for every one of us watching. It's really painful to see how many beautiful, beautiful buildings and statues were destroyed, but also the hardship that Tibetans in Drago had to go through. So it's very impressive what you've been able to find and put together in this report. Thank you for sharing. And John, I'd like to pull you into this conversation. We have spoken before, and in many senses, like Choekyi just also mentioned, Drago is just kind of a blueprint of what's really happening in wider Tibet. Could you speak a little bit more about how this reflects the kind of general strategy that the Chinese Communist Party is applying to further the oppressions of Tibetans in Tibet?
Sure, I can certainly have a go. So I think the key thing, since we're discussing with some of the TSGs about how to use this report, is that the information in this report is probably best utilized in context. So we can talk about root causes and also see where the issues here align with some of the other campaigns that Tibet groups are pursuing. So we know that since Xi came to power, and particularly since he consolidated power in 2017, there have been some massive drives to sinicize key aspects of Tibetan culture. These might take the form, for example, of the dispatch of thousands of party cadres all across Tibet to educate monks and nuns on Xi Jinping thought. These would be facilitated by institutions such as the United Front Work Department and bureaus of religious affairs, but they're implementing policies devised by the central government in Beijing. We know that regulations have been imposed on monasteries on what activities they can carry out, and that these regulations seem to tighten with every year, ensuring that while monasteries and nunneries continue to run, their role historically in things such as providing education is greatly curtailed. And we've seen that even before Xi Jinping came to power, there were changes such as the deployment of mass surveillance teams all across Tibet. There was one policy, for example, in 2011, Benefit the Masses, which was supposed to be temporary, but appears to have just grown and grown to the extent that even rural areas are flooded with police and other surveillance forces. So all of these different levels of regulation and repression and surveillance, they intersect and they suffocate Tibetans' daily lives. And the residents of Drago County are a perfect case study of how these top-down dictates from Beijing, implemented by local officials, can turn Tibetans' lives upside down. So we can draw a few parallels. One of them was mentioned by Choekyi, and that's the role of this guy Wang Dongsheng, who was appointed the party secretary for Drago County in October 2021. One of his previous roles, as Choekyi mentioned, as deputy party secretary of Sertar County, was overseeing thousands of forced removals of monks and nuns at Larangar, but also restrictions on the daily activities of the monks and nuns that remained in that institution, such as their ability to observe religious practices. We also know, for example, that prior to the demolitions in Drago County, there was an annual report on the implementation of this policy called Xi Jinping Thought on the rule of law. This sort of guiding principles that party cadres have been ordered to implement all across Tibet as part of this sinicization process. And we know that local officials there had been criticized for their shoddy implementation of Xi Jinping Thought, that they were given some guidelines on how to rectify this, and they were urged to impose tighter restrictions on the community. So we might ask also, did this prompt some of the violence that we saw in Drago County? The key message all along is that this is not an isolated case. This is not somewhere where local authorities are simply taking matters into their own hands. They're implementing far greater policies, which we're likely to be seeing in other parts of Tibet, or more correctly, that we're unlikely to see because so much of Tibet is cut off from the outside world. So Drago County gives us a unique window into how some of these policies take effect, the effect that they have on locals, and also give us a clue about what to expect might be happening in other parts of Tibet. With some of the existing campaigns, I think there's some obvious connections we can also make. So we heard about the destruction of a school, and we know that this is taking place in several other areas of Tibet. There's been destructions of Tibetan language schools, arrest of teachers, at the same time that 1 million Tibetan children between the ages of 4 and 18 have been funneled into this residential preschool and boarding school program, where they're cut off from the Tibetan language, they're not taught about their own culture, they're given a CCP orientated education. So I think the key is drawing these parallels in our advocacy efforts, being clever as a movement with how much we try to do at one time. So there's some groups, Free Tibet, for example, we can campaign on Drago County. Others might have fewer resources, but we still think that they can draw on some of these findings and feed them into other campaigns. And I think either way, the key message is that when they speak to the targets of their advocacy, they need to convey the horrors that this report sheds light on, and give the unique level of detail that reports like this are able to capture, but also really driving home the point that this is happening all across Tibet, including areas that are less accessible, and it's all down to this top-down CCP occupation.
Thanks, John, for this answer. You've kind of already introduced or spoke a bit about the next question that I wanted to ask you, which was really, you just outlined kind of the bigger picture, what's happening in Tibet. And I assume people will be outraged just as I am. And for everyone who's watching and who maybe is not currently part of a, Tibet group that does advocacy, what can they do with this information? So let's say I've read the report, I've listened to what both of you just told me. So what can I do with it?
I think this discussion, the key thing is that there's different levels of activity that different groups can take away. So I don't think it's going to be a one-size-fits-all situation. This report's a microcosm of almost all of the main threats posed to Tibet and Tibetans' identity and the next generation of Tibetans, from education, from co-opting religion, eradicating culture, mass surveillance, torture. It even has historic context. So in that sense, it's a tool to approach MPs and policymakers with one of the most timely and complete summaries of what repression in Tibet looks like. But it can also be used to supplement existing campaigns. So I know that many groups, for example, are engaged in the campaign on the residential schools. There's details in there about the destruction of a school. It's a perfect case study to show how children are driven into these boarding schools. Some groups work on torture or re-education. Some groups work on the eradication of Tibet's religion and culture. That's in there too. I would even say that the groups that work on the DNA campaign, one of the cases that we're trying to make when approaching the company who's to target the campaign, Thermo Fisher, is conveying to them that you cannot be supplying the police in Tibet with all of this high-tech equipment to sequence Tibetan's DNA, because the police are not honest, trustworthy actors in Tibet. What they are doing is propping up an occupation. And so there's ammunition in there for people to make that point too. There are, that being said, specific asks. So if you go to the recommendations at the back of the report, some of the ones we're pursuing are recommending to missions in China that they demand a site visit to Drago County to assess the damage and to call with consultation with the locals for restoration of some of the sites that have been destroyed. And there's also calls to use the examples in the report to impress upon the Chinese government the need to respect Tibetans' religion and culture. I think what might be a helpful way forward for some of the groups is that Choekyi and I are always happy to assist with advocacy. If you want to have one-to-one chats with us about how to tailor this report and its findings into your advocacy strategy, one of us can assist with that. We can sit in a meeting with your government officials with you and just ensure that groups can get the most out of this report.
Thank you, John. And I think kind of, if you're watching right now and you're not part of any Tibet group yet that is doing all the good work that John has just mentioned, definitely go and look up. You can go on our website, for instance, to see what Tibet group would be in close by, and that you can join. And like John just mentioned, definitely take up their offer to speak to them directly and get briefed on the report and on the asks that you can post. I just want to put out a little reminder to everyone who's watching at the moment. If you have any questions, please feel free to add them to the comment section. Currently, we just have really nice comments. So thank you for this. Choekyi, maybe you suggested you could read a little poem. So let's do this. And then maybe in the meantime, we get some other questions in there. And otherwise, we'll round it up.
So thank you, Leila. I was thinking of reading a very short stanza from a poem called We Who Are Ruled by Others by Pema Rinchen, who is a poet, writer from Drago County. I think it's really important that we pay attention to what the writers inside Tibet they are writing. They go through great risk to understand the pain of the society and then put them in writing. And High Peaks Pure Earth has published a translation of his poem. And Pema Rinchen, when he was detained, he was very badly beaten and he was taken to a hospital for emergency treatment. But when his family learned about this and they rushed to the hospital to see him, they were crying, but they were still barred from meeting him. So Pema, in this poem, which comes from a book called Look, that sort of goes through what Tibetans went through in 2008 uprising and the Yushu earthquake and Chinese policies. This stanza, I think, is very evocative of just the pain that Tibetans go through. So it says, the past years and months is a history written in blood. Tears of sadness mark the present. What comes in the future is fallen in fear. Hearts of kinsmen of the snowland are suffering unbearably. So it's just one stanza. You can find the whole, the entire poem on High Peaks Pure Earth. Because Drago County and in specifically and Tibet in general, I think that we have a lot of stories of Tibetans getting arrested, detained, beaten, and all of these are sometimes just reduced to human rights violation story. But then it's not just that, the root of the problem is invasion. When you don't have your own land, freedom in your own land, if it's still under occupation, then comes all these scales of violations of different patterns and techniques. And I think that people who have been able to hold on to their language and have that courage, moral courage to put into words what their own people are going through are very important in society. So what Pema Rinchen wrote in the poem, I think, shows how when there is no freedom in your own land, and all that hope for freedom is still not respected and answered, it is a pain that reverberates from past to future.
Thank you so much for sharing this, Choekyi. We do have a few questions. Just the first question was, and any of you can answer. Maybe John, you have an idea on this one. Someone is asking if about your thoughts about the report by Amnesty International on China's human rights, and they're specifying that they would like to I just show the next comment. Do you see any difference between the report with US report as well as the TCHRC report? John.
You won't get the best answer from us because we still have to do the full reading. I've had a brief look at the Amnesty report just because I used to work there and I'm still invested in that organisation. And I know that they have a whole section on Tibet there. They tend to be very brief, but there's a list of the political prisoner cases, and they do highlight continued threats to freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and also the fact that protests against the occupation are put down. Amnesty occasionally does bigger thematic reports, which is probably the best place to go if you wanted to get something a bit more substantial on Tibet. Same with Human Rights Watch. Otherwise, I would say that they seem to be, as usual, very broadly critical of the Chinese government in general. I remember that process at Amnesty, there was only so much word count that you get for each country, and I imagine this would have been a particularly difficult one for the China researchers to write because you can only use so many words to convey so much horror on so many different levels. The TCHRD report, I need to work through it. I'd say they complement each other. We need to draw on all of them. Human Rights Watch too.
Thank you, John. We have another question by Lobsang La. The question is, Tibet is not just only a human rights or cultural rights issue, but it's about the Chinese government's occupation and a political issue. There's a danger that Tibet issue can be seen only as a human rights issue. What do you think of this? And I'm happy to hear both of you.
Maybe you first, Choekyi. Unless you want me to go first.
No, I can. I mean, I 100,000% agree with this issue of how Tibet has been reduced to this language of just human rights, I find it very, very disturbing, to be honest. First of all, as a Tibetan, how, for those of us, regardless of whether being born in or outside Tibet, know that Tibet was invaded by China. That's the bottom, that's the foundation of the truth to start with. We can go through many of the, details of the dates and when and hows, but then the fact remains that it was invaded and it still remains under occupation. And if we think about all these violations that are happening inside Tibet, whether it's cultural, religious, or linguistic, all of these boil down to invasion. And so the reluctance I find in the politicians and in other, Tibet supporters to see this fact as it is doing a great disservice to a vital part of our world history as well. There's been no colonization of scale that happened in Tibet since Second World War. Since Second World War, Tibet has been the largest country to ever have been colonized and still remains under occupation. So I think that this is, I completely agree.
I'm not going to better that answer. I think that when we do our advocacy work, you're always looking to say that these problems are symptoms of an occupation, and that they will only truly go away once the occupation is over. There are some groups that do work with human rights forums where obviously they put human rights front and center. They want to minimize the abuses. But I think as a movement, we're always looking to tie the issue back to the greater evil, which is the initial invasion and occupation, and really using those talking points that many of these crises will not be resolved, whether it's Drago County or whether it's Tibet's environmental crisis, unless Tibetans once again have the power in their hands to run their own country.
Thank you so much for this. I'd like to round up the comments and the questions, but anyone, if you have any more questions, if you're watching the recording of this, just please share and we'll make sure that some answers come back to you. Thank you both so much for sharing your insights into the Chanko report, but also, to the wider processes that are happening in occupied Tibet. Thank you for everyone watching today and for sending in your questions. I hope I'll see you next time again. And again, please read the report and reach out to us if you have any questions on it. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thanks, Leila.
Thanks, Leila, and thanks, Choekyi. Great to meet with you as well.